It was a cold night in December 1773. The wind from the Boston harbor carried the scent of salt and tension. The city was silent, but inside the hearts of its people, a storm was rising. For years, the colonies had been pushed down by unfair taxes from Britain. Every coin they earned felt stolen, every law passed without their voice. And when the British decided to tax their tea, it became the last drop in a cup already full. Among the angry and tired citizens stood Samuel Adams and a small group of men called the Sons of Liberty. They were not soldiers or kings. They were carpenters, merchants, and farmers, ordinary men with extraordinary courage. They gathered in secret rooms, whispering about freedom, about dignity, about what it would take to stand against the most powerful empire in the world. They knew it was dangerous. But they also knew that silence meant slavery. That night, they met near Griffin's Wharf, a small, dark place close to the water. The air was cold, their breaths visible in the moonlight. They spoke softly, hearts pounding with fear and purpose. The plan was clear: they would not allow the British tea to be unloaded. The message would be loud, even if no words were spoken. One man looked at the others and said quietly, "Tonight, we show them we are not afraid." To hide their identities, the men dressed as Mohawk Indians. It was not to mock anyone, it was to protect their lives. With paint on their faces and rough blankets on their shoulders, they walked silently through the narrow Boston streets. No one stopped them. Every step felt heavier, every heartbeat faster. They were risking everything: their freedom, their families, their lives, for a dream that did not yet exist. When they reached the harbor, 3 ships stood still in the dark water. The ships were full of tea, a symbol of British power. The moonlight danced on the surface of the water, calm and peaceful, but inside the men, the fire of defiance burned. They climbed aboard. No shouts, no chaos, only the sound of boots on wood and hearts in rhythm. Then a voice broke the silence: "Throw it overboard." Wood cracked, lids broke, and heavy chests of tea tumbled into the sea. The water splashed, dark and cold, swallowing the tea leaves one after another. It was not just tea they were throwing, it was their chains. For hours, they worked in silence, hundreds of chests sinking beneath the waves. The air smelled of salt, smoke, and freedom. By morning, Boston woke to the unbelievable sight. The harbor was covered in floating tea. The British called it an act of rebellion. The colonists called it the birth of justice. The punishment came quickly. Britain closed Boston's ports and sent soldiers to control the city. But something powerful had already begun. Instead of fear, there was unity. The colonies, once separate and divided, began to think of themselves as one. The Boston Tea Party became more than an act of protest. It was a symbol of courage, a message that ordinary people could stand against kings and armies. It was a promise that freedom was worth any cost. From that cold December night, the path to independence had begun. The sound of those falling tea chests echoed far beyond Boston. It became the heartbeat of a new nation. Freedom comes with sacrifice, and on that night, a few brave men proved that even the smallest act of courage can change the course of history. The morning after the Boston Tea Party was silent, but the silence was heavy. The sun rose over the harbor, and what once had been calm blue water was now dark and full of tea leaves floating like ashes after a fire. People came out from their homes, looking in disbelief. The air was filled with whispers: some were proud, others afraid. The men who had done it stayed, hidden. They knew the British would strike back, and they were ready to face whatever came next. Soon, news of the protest spread across the colonies. In New York, Philadelphia, and Virginia, people spoke with excitement and fear. Some said the men in Boston were heroes, others said they were foolish to anger the king. But deep down, every colonist knew something had changed. The chains of obedience were breaking. They had taken the first step toward freedom, and there was no going back now. When the British found out, anger filled the royal court. King George III could not believe his subjects would dare to destroy property worth thousands of pounds. He called it an act of treason. Orders were sent quickly across the sea: Boston would be punished. The British Navy surrounded the harbor, blocking all ships from entering or leaving. No goods, no food, no supplies. The city that once thrived with trade was suddenly starving. But instead of surrendering, the people of Boston grew stronger. Other colonies sent food and money to help them survive. For the first time, Americans began to see themselves not as separate colonies but as one people facing a common enemy. The spirit of unity was born. Men and women met in secret, sharing plans, hopes, and courage. Churches rang their bells, calling people to gather and pray for freedom. Among those who watched all this unfold was a young printer named Paul Revere. He understood that this moment would decide the future. He and others began spreading messages between colonies, warning them of British movements and inspiring them to stand together. The streets that once echoed with fear now echoed with determination. Children whispered stories of the tea rebels, and mothers told their sons to be brave like them. In England, Parliament passed what they called the Coercive Acts, but the colonists named them the Intolerable Acts. Soldiers were placed in Boston homes without permission. Meetings were banned. Freedom was slowly being strangled. Yet, even with soldiers on every corner, people refused to bow. They spoke softly but firmly about liberty, justice, and the right to live with dignity. Then came the call for a meeting, not of kings, but of ordinary men. Representatives from each colony gathered in Philadelphia in 1774. It was the First Continental Congress, and for the first time, they spoke as Americans. They decided to stand united against British oppression. The seed planted on that December night at Boston Harbor had started to grow. Months passed, and tension turned into conflict. Soldiers and farmers faced each other on the fields of Lexington and Concord. Shots were fired, and the American Revolution began. Many of those who had thrown tea into the sea now carried muskets in their hands. They had started a movement that could no longer be silenced. Years later, when freedom was finally won, people looked back on that one night, the night ordinary men chose courage over fear. It wasn't just about tea. It was about honor, dignity, and the belief that no empire could own the human spirit. From that cold night in Boston grew the heart of a nation that would one day stand for freedom for all. Even now, centuries later, the story of the Boston Tea Party reminds the world that courage begins with a single act, and that the fight for justice never truly ends. Winter in Boston had grown colder, not just in weather but in spirit. The people were tired, hungry, and angry. British soldiers marched through the streets with pride, showing their power. Every step of their boots reminded the colonists that they were not free. The harbor was still closed, and ships carrying food or goods were turned away. Families struggled to survive, yet no one was ready to give up. In small homes and hidden corners, men met quietly. They whispered about freedom, about how long they could live under such control. Some feared speaking out, knowing the British could punish anyone they suspected. But others, like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, refused to stay silent. They spoke of justice, of standing together. They believed that if they stayed united, they could win back their rights, even if it meant war. At the same time, spies and informers moved among them. The British kept watch on every meeting, every message. They wanted to crush the spirit of rebellion before it spread. But the more they tried to silence the people, the stronger the voices became. Newspapers printed words of defiance. Pamphlets were passed hand to hand, filled with hope and courage. The idea of liberty had become a flame that no soldier could put out. In one of these gatherings, a group of farmers, blacksmiths, and ordinary men stood up and made a promise. They would not let the sacrifice at the Boston Tea Party be wasted. They would continue the fight until the colonies were free. They trained secretly, learning to shoot, to march, to prepare for battle. They called themselves Minutemen, ready to fight at a minute's notice. Meanwhile, tensions grew worse. The British Army demanded obedience, but the people demanded respect. General Gage, the British commander, tried to keep order through fear. He sent soldiers to search homes for weapons and arrest anyone spreading rebellion. But every act of force only pushed the people further away. Boston was becoming a city ready to explode. Across the colonies, the news of Boston's suffering stirred hearts. In Virginia, George Washington spoke with anger and pride. In Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin wrote letters urging unity. The colonies, once separate and distant, now stood together. What had started as a protest about tea had turned into a movement for freedom. In April 1775, the moment finally came. British soldiers marched toward Concord to seize weapons hidden by the colonists. But word spread quickly, carried by riders through the night. Among them was Paul Revere, galloping through the dark streets shouting, "The British are coming." His voice woke farmers and blacksmiths who grabbed their muskets and ran to defend their land. When dawn broke over Lexington, both sides stood face to face, redcoats against farmers with worn boots and strong hearts. No one knows who fired first, but that single shot became the start of a revolution. Smoke filled the air, and the dream of freedom became a reality paid for in blood. Back in Boston, people heard the news with both fear and pride. The war they had prayed to avoid had begun, but it was a war for something greater, a life where they could live by their own laws, not those of a distant king. Mothers sent their sons to fight, fathers left their fields behind. As months passed, battles spread across the land. The colonies bled and struggled, but they never gave up. The memory of that night at the harbor kept them strong, a reminder of why they fought. It wasn't for tea, or money, or power. It was for freedom, dignity, and the hope of a better future. Even through loss and hardship, the people of America held on to one truth: freedom always comes with sacrifice. And because of their courage, a new nation was born, one that would forever carry the spirit of that winter night in Boston. The war had truly begun now. The sound of drums and muskets echoed across the fields and towns of America. Every family felt its weight. Sons left their homes to fight, mothers prayed by candlelight, waiting for news that often never came. Boston, once the center of protest, had turned into a fortress controlled by British troops. The city streets were filled with soldiers, and fear was everywhere. But beyond those walls, the spirit of freedom was alive and burning stronger than ever. The Continental Army was formed, and George Washington was chosen as its leader. He was calm, brave, and full of hope, even when things looked impossible. His men had little food, no proper uniforms, and hardly any weapons. Yet they marched forward, believing in something bigger than themselves, the dream of liberty. Washington's voice gave them strength. "We are not fighting for land," he said, "we are fighting for our children's future." The early battles were hard. The British army was powerful, trained, and well-armed. The Americans were farmers, shopkeepers, and blacksmiths who had never been soldiers before. Many doubted they could win, but each small victory gave them courage. When they won at places like Concord and Bunker Hill, hope began to spread. People realized that maybe, just maybe, they could defeat an empire. In Philadelphia, the leaders of the colonies met again. They discussed what the next step should be. The idea of complete independence began to rise, something that once seemed impossible. Thomas Jefferson, a quiet and thoughtful man, wrote the words that would change history: "All men are created equal." Those words became the heart of the Declaration of Independence, signed on July 4, 1776. It was not just a document, it was a promise that America would no longer live under the shadow of a king. When the British heard of it, their anger turned to rage. The war grew even fiercer. Cities burned, families were torn apart, and fields that once grew food now became battlefields. But the Americans did not give up. They learned to fight in forests, to use the land to their advantage. They fought not for glory, but for freedom. Back in Boston, those who had started the rebellion watched from afar as their dreams spread across the land. Samuel Adams often said, "We lit the spark, but the people made it a fire." The same harbor that once held floating tea now symbolized the beginning of a revolution that would reach every corner of America. Winter brought new challenges. Washington's army camped at Valley Forge, cold and hungry. Many soldiers had no shoes, their feet bleeding on the frozen ground. Yet they stayed. They trained, suffered, and waited for spring. They sang songs of hope, remembering the cause they were fighting for. Their pain turned into strength. As time passed, help came from unexpected places. France joined the fight, sending ships, soldiers, and supplies. The tide of war began to change. The Americans started to win more battles, slowly pushing the British back. Each victory felt like a step toward destiny. Finally, after years of struggle, the end came at Yorktown in 1781. Surrounded and outnumbered, the British army surrendered. Cheers broke out across the land. People cried, hugged, and thanked God. The war was over. The colonies had become a nation, the United States of America. In Boston, old men looked at the harbor and remembered that night when tea filled the water. It all began there, with courage and defiance. The story of the Boston Tea Party was no longer just about protest, it was the first heartbeat of a free nation. As freedom bells rang, one truth remained clear: liberty was never given, it was earned by those who refused to bow. The sacrifices, the pain, and the bravery of ordinary people had built a country where freedom would live forever. After the war ended, the land that had once been filled with smoke and blood finally began to breathe again. America was free, but freedom came with new challenges. The people had won independence, yet they now had to learn how to live as one nation. There was no king, no royal rule, and no guidebook to follow. 13 colonies had to come together and build something new, a country based on the idea that all men were equal. George Washington returned home a hero. People admired him for his honesty, strength, and calm nature. He never saw himself as a ruler but as a servant of the people. Soon, the leaders asked him to become the first president of the United States. Though he wanted a quiet life, he accepted, knowing that the country still needed guidance. Under his leadership, the young nation started to take its first steps toward unity. The country was not perfect. There were disagreements, fears, and doubts. Some people worried about how to share power between states and the central government. Others argued over money, laws, and the future. But they all knew one truth: they didn't fight the British just to fall apart now. So they worked together, slowly building a government that represented the voice of the people. The Constitution was written to guide the nation. It was a document unlike any other, not made for kings or the powerful, but for ordinary citizens. It promised liberty, justice, and opportunity. The Bill of Rights soon followed, giving people freedom of speech, religion, and the press. These were not just laws, they were dreams turned into words, the foundation of a new world. Still, life after war was hard. Cities like Boston had to rebuild. Fields destroyed by battle needed planting again. Soldiers returned home to find their families struggling. Yet, there was pride in their pain. Every scar, every loss reminded them of what they had fought for. Women who had supported the war now took on stronger roles in their homes and communities. Children grew up hearing stories of bravery and sacrifice, learning that freedom was something to be protected. In Boston, the harbor was once again busy with ships. Merchants traded goods, and laughter returned to the streets. But older citizens still remembered the night when tea floated on the waves. They spoke about it with tears and pride. What began as an act of rebellion had turned into the start of a new world. That single act of courage had shaken an empire and built a nation. Across America, people celebrated their independence each year, remembering the sacrifices that made it possible. Bells rang, fireworks lit up the sky, and the flag waved high, a symbol of the courage that began in dark times. But they also knew that freedom was not a gift to keep untouched. It had to be defended, respected, and passed down to the next generation. Washington often reminded the people that unity was their greatest strength. He warned them not to let anger or division destroy what they had built. Liberty, he said, is the light that guides us, but it can fade if we forget what it cost. His words became a reminder for every American to protect the dream their ancestors had fought for. As the years passed, America grew, towns became cities, and fields became factories. The nation faced more challenges, more conflicts, and more tests of courage. Yet every time, people remembered where it all began: a group of brave men standing against unfair power, choosing to fight for justice. The Boston Tea Party had started as a protest, but it became a lesson for all time, that ordinary people can change history when they stand together. The story lived on not just in books, but in the heart of every American who believes in freedom, courage, and hope. Years after independence, America was still young and learning. The streets that once echoed with war cries now carried the sound of hammers and laughter. People were rebuilding their lives, towns were growing, and hope was spreading across the land. But freedom was not an easy path. The wounds of war were deep, and the new nation had to face its own struggles, hunger, debt, and the challenge of staying united. The farmers worked from sunrise to sunset, trying to recover from the damage the war had left behind. Many had lost family members, but they carried on, believing they were building something bigger than themselves. Every brick laid, every seed planted felt like a promise to the future. The dream of America was growing slowly, built by hard hands and strong hearts. In Boston, the memories of rebellion still lived in the hearts of the people. Children learned from their parents about the brave men who had stood against the empire. The harbor, once dark and silent, was alive again with trade and ships. But now, instead of British goods, it carried the signs of a free nation. People felt proud knowing that the water which once held floating tea now reflected the light of liberty. Meanwhile, across the country, leaders continued to shape the young nation. George Washington, though tired and aging, worked to keep peace among the states. He dreamed of a country where every citizen could live without fear. He often reminded people that freedom was not just about independence from Britain, it was about unity, respect, and justice within their own land. But not everyone agreed. Disputes over money and power began to rise. Some states wanted more control, while others feared another form of tyranny. Washington tried to balance both sides, guiding them like a father guiding his children. "We must stand together," he said, "or we will fall apart." His words reminded everyone that freedom without unity could never last. Ordinary people continued their quiet struggles. Veterans of the war looked for work, families moved west searching for better land, and new towns appeared near rivers and forests. America was expanding, and with it came both hope and challenge. Life was simple but full of purpose. People helped one another, shared food, and built schools so their children could learn about the new nation's ideals, liberty and equality. As the years passed, the country began to form its own identity. Art, music, and storytelling became part of its culture. People gathered around fires, telling tales of the revolution, of the night when tea filled the Boston Harbor, and of the courage that gave birth to their nation. Each story carried pride and lessons, that real freedom is never free, and that every generation must protect it. In the hearts of the young, those stories planted dreams. Boys wanted to grow into honest leaders, and girls wanted to raise children who valued truth and kindness. America was learning that its strength was not just in its army, but in the goodness of its people. Though times were not always easy, there was faith. Churches filled with prayers of gratitude. Farmers thanked God for their harvests. Neighbors stood together through hard winters and celebrated together in good times. There was still struggle, but there was peace too, the kind that comes when a nation knows who it is. And in Boston, every December, people still remembered that night of the Boston Tea Party. Lanterns glowed in windows, ships in the harbor waved small flags, and storytellers spoke of bravery and unity. They told how a handful of determined men changed the course of history. That story remained alive, not as a tale of anger, but as a reminder that courage, when guided by hope, can build a nation that lasts forever. Years turned into decades, and America continued to grow. What had started as 13 small colonies was now becoming a land full of promise and opportunity. Roads stretched farther, towns turned into cities, and trade spread from one coast to the other. The people worked hard, building homes, schools, and farms. They carried the same spirit that had built the nation: courage, sacrifice, and unity. But even in peace, challenges never truly ended. The country began to face new problems. Some states disagreed over laws and rights. Others argued about how power should be shared between the government and the people. These differences often led to heated debates, and sometimes even hatred. Yet many wise voices reminded the nation of its roots, that freedom had been won through unity, and that division would only destroy what had been built with so much sacrifice. In Boston, where the journey had begun, life had changed completely. The city was thriving again. Ships filled the harbor, carrying goods not from a king's command but from the hands of free men. Markets were full, streets were alive, and families lived without the fear of soldiers at their doors. The people took pride in knowing that their city's courage had given birth to the nation's freedom. The story of the Boston Tea Party was no longer just a memory, it had become part of the nation's soul. Schools taught children about the heroes of the Revolution. They learned about Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, men who risked everything for justice. Teachers told the story of how ordinary citizens stood up against unfair power. Every child who listened felt proud to be an American. The lessons were clear: courage, unity, and standing for truth were the true marks of freedom. However, freedom also brought responsibility. The government needed to protect its people, create fair laws, and ensure peace. George Washington had warned that power must always serve the people, not control them. His message echoed through generations, guiding leaders who came after him. Some followed his wisdom, while others forgot, leading to new mistakes. But through every challenge, America learned, adapted, and grew stronger. New voices began to rise: inventors, thinkers, and dreamers who wanted to shape the future. They believed America could be more than just free, it could be great. They built machines, discovered new lands, and explored new ideas. Roads and railways connected the nation, bringing distant places closer together. The dream of liberty now expanded into a dream of progress. Yet, even in these times of growth, the shadows of inequality and injustice began to appear. Some people were still treated unfairly, and others were denied the same freedoms the revolution had promised. But there were always brave men and women ready to speak up, just like those who had stood in Boston years before. They believed that freedom must belong to everyone, not just a few. Families gathered each year to celebrate Independence Day. The skies filled with light, and people cheered for the country they loved. But beneath the fireworks, elders reminded the young of what freedom truly meant. It wasn't just celebration, it was duty. The Boston Tea Party had shown that even a small act of courage could change history, and that truth still inspired the new generation. As America expanded, so did its hopes. Farmers dreamed of better harvests, sailors dreamed of new trade routes, and teachers dreamed of wiser students. The nation stood tall, proud of its journey, aware of its mistakes, and hopeful for its future. And through it all, one story continued to live, the story of how tea thrown into a harbor became the first spark of a revolution. It reminded every American that no matter how far the country went, it must never forget the night when ordinary people stood up for justice and changed the world forever. Even after independence, life in America was not easy. The new nation had to learn how to govern itself, and people had to adjust to freedom. Families struggled to rebuild homes destroyed by the war, farms had to be replanted, and cities needed repair. Yet, despite hardship, there was hope. People knew they had earned something precious, a chance to live in a land where they could make their own choices. The leaders of the new nation worked tirelessly. George Washington guided the country with care and wisdom, reminding citizens that freedom was both a gift and a responsibility. Laws were written to protect rights, and the Constitution became the framework that would hold the country together. Citizens debated, argued, and sometimes disagreed, but slowly, a system began to take shape. The lessons of unity learned during the Revolution remained crucial. Across the colonies, ordinary people began to feel the impact of independence in their daily lives. Farmers who had fought for freedom now returned to their fields, planting crops and feeding families. Merchants reopened shops, and craftsmen rebuilt what had been lost. Every effort, small or large, was a step toward creating a nation that could thrive on its own. People realized that freedom was not only about fighting enemies but also about building and maintaining a fair society. Education became important. Children were taught about the struggle for independence and the sacrifices made by those who had fought. They learned that courage, justice, and unity were the pillars of a strong nation. Stories of bravery, like the Boston Tea Party, inspired them to believe that ordinary people could change the course of history. Teachers reminded students that freedom carried responsibility, to act with honesty, respect, and fairness. In Boston, the harbor remained a symbol of courage. Ships now carried goods freely, and the city was alive with trade and commerce. People remembered the night when tea was thrown into the water and how that simple act became a spark for a nation's fight for liberty. Every year, citizens celebrated that night, not only for the rebellion but for the hope and courage it represented. While America grew, challenges remained. Some states argued about power, others about money. Some people did not yet enjoy the same freedoms, and social issues persisted. But there were always leaders and ordinary citizens who stood up for justice, determined to make the country better. They knew that the fight for liberty was ongoing and required vigilance from every generation. Communities strengthened as people helped each other rebuild. Neighbors shared resources, families worked together, and communities celebrated successes together. The country was learning that freedom was not only a right but also a responsibility to help others and protect the nation's values. Ordinary acts of courage and kindness were as important as battles fought on the fields. As America expanded, the nation's spirit of exploration and ambition grew. New towns were founded, roads were built, and trade routes opened. Farmers, merchants, and sailors worked together to create a strong economy. The dream of liberty transformed into a vision of progress, showing that the country could grow while honoring the principles that won its freedom. Through all the struggles, one story remained alive: the Boston Tea Party. It reminded people that change starts with courage, and that even small acts of bravery can shape the future. It was more than a protest, it was a symbol of hope, determination, and the belief that ordinary people could stand against injustice. And so, America continued, learning from its past, facing challenges with determination, and building a nation where freedom, courage, and unity were at the heart of everything. The story of that night in Boston lived on, inspiring generations to protect and honor the hard-won liberty of their nation. The Boston Tea Party had left a mark that went far beyond the harbor. Ordinary people had shown that courage and unity could challenge even the strongest empire. But the aftermath was not easy. The British punished Boston, closing its ports and sending more soldiers. Food became scarce, and families struggled to survive. Fear was everywhere, but so was determination. People knew they could not back down. Every day, ordinary citizens acted with quiet bravery. Farmers worked their fields even under threat, and merchants tried to keep their shops open despite restrictions. Neighbors shared what little they had, teaching one another that survival depended on community. Each act of resilience strengthened the bonds between the people and reminded them why they had risked so much that December night. At the same time, leaders in Boston and other colonies worked in secret. They planned how to resist, how to communicate, and how to unite. Messages were sent carefully, hidden from British eyes. People met quietly in taverns and homes, speaking of freedom and the future they hoped to build. It was dangerous, but they believed that liberty was worth the risk. The story of that night began to travel across the colonies. In New York, Philadelphia, and Virginia, citizens heard about the bold act of throwing the tea into the harbor. Some admired it, some feared it, but everyone realized something had changed. The colonies were no longer separate communities, they were part of a movement that demanded justice. The spark of rebellion had grown into a fire that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, the British tried to maintain control. Soldiers patrolled streets, searching for weapons and stopping any gatherings. But each attempt to intimidate only made the colonists more determined. People learned to resist without confrontation, to hide their plans, and to protect each other. Ordinary men and women became teachers of courage, showing that strength came not only from armies but also from unity and cleverness. In Boston, the harbor slowly returned to life. Ships carried goods, but the memory of that night remained in every wave. Citizens talked quietly about the courage it took to act against the British. They knew that even a small group of people could influence the course of history. Children heard stories about the men disguised as Mohawk Indians and began to understand that standing up for what is right often requires risk. Beyond Boston, the colonies began to see the need for organized resistance. Committees were formed, meetings held in secret, and plans made for future action. People understood that freedom required preparation, sacrifice, and strategy. Courage alone was not enough, they had to think carefully and act wisely. The Boston Tea Party also inspired hope. It reminded the people that no power is absolute, and that even ordinary citizens can make a difference. It was no longer just a story of rebellion, it became a lesson in leadership, courage, and community. Families repeated the story to their children, ensuring that the meaning of freedom and justice would survive for generations. Years later, when independence was finally achieved, the night of the Boston Tea Party was remembered as a turning point. It was proof that standing together and risking everything for justice could change history. The harbor, once filled with floating tea, had become a symbol of hope and determination, inspiring a nation to fight for its dreams. Even today, the lesson remains: ordinary people, united by courage and principle, can challenge injustice and leave a mark on the world. The Boston Tea Party was not just an act of defiance, it was the beginning of a story that would shape America forever. After the Boston Tea Party, the people of Boston knew their fight was far from over. The British tightened control, sending soldiers to watch the streets and enforce harsh laws. Life became difficult for ordinary families. Food was scarce, shops struggled to open, and fear hung in the air. Still, the citizens refused to give up. They understood that freedom was earned, not given, and each day of resistance mattered. Ordinary men and women continued to act with quiet courage. Farmers tended their crops despite the danger, and neighbors shared whatever they could. People learned to protect one another, hiding messages and supplies from British soldiers. Each small act of bravery kept hope alive. The city may have been watched, but its spirit remained free. Word of Boston's resistance spread across the colonies. In New York, Philadelphia, and Virginia, people heard about the brave men who had risked everything to throw tea into the harbor. Some admired them, others feared them, but all recognized that change had begun. The colonies, once separate and distant, started to see themselves as one community united by a common cause. The rebellion in Boston became a spark that ignited hope across the land. British attempts to punish Boston often backfired. The more they tried to control the people, the stronger the colonists' determination grew. Soldiers patrolled streets and searched homes, but the citizens found ways to resist peacefully. They held secret meetings, sent hidden letters, and taught each other courage. Ordinary people realized that they could fight without guns, using intelligence, patience, and unity. In Boston, the harbor slowly returned to normal. Ships began to bring goods, but the memory of that night never faded. People told stories of the men disguised as Mohawk Indians, teaching children the importance of standing up for what is right. Families reminded each other that even small acts of bravery could change history. The harbor had become more than a place for trade, it was a symbol of defiance, courage, and hope. Across the colonies, leaders began to organize. Committees were formed, plans for resistance were drawn, and ordinary citizens learned the value of preparation. Freedom required more than courage, it required unity, strategy, and persistence. The people understood that winning liberty would take time, effort, and sacrifice, but they were ready to face the challenge. The Boston Tea Party inspired not just resistance, but hope for the future. It showed that ordinary citizens could influence the course of history. Families shared the story with their children, ensuring that lessons of bravery, justice, and responsibility were passed down. It became a story that reminded everyone that freedom is never free and that standing for justice often requires risk. As tensions grew, the colonies moved closer to full rebellion. Leaders and citizens alike understood that their actions in Boston were the start of something larger. The small act of courage had grown into a movement that could no longer be ignored. People across America began to prepare, knowing that their unity and determination would shape the nation's destiny. Years later, when independence was achieved, the Boston Tea Party was remembered as a turning point. It was proof that courage, combined with unity and purpose, could challenge even the most powerful empire. The floating tea in the harbor became a symbol, not of destruction, but of hope, determination, and the power of ordinary people to change the world. The story of Boston reminds every generation that liberty requires effort, courage, and sacrifice. It teaches that ordinary individuals, when united by a common purpose, can make history. What began as a single act of defiance became the foundation for a nation built on freedom, justice, and hope, a nation that continues to inspire the world.